Thank you for joining us. My name is Jonathan Carr-West. I'm Chief Exec of LGIU, the Local Government Information Unit, and delighted to welcome you all here to our second Global Local Executive Panel of 2024. So before we get into the meat of today's discussion, I just want to say good morning to all of you, and indeed good evening to those of you who are joining us from other parts of the world. It's great to see you all again. At LGIU, we host these discussions because we think that the most innovative, the most effective, the most grounded answers to many of the global challenges we face, like the one we're talking about this morning, many of the answers to those problems sit within and come from local government around the world. But we know that local government often is the one at the sharp end of dealing with these problems and often is the place where that innovation happens. But we also know that when you're in the kind of nitty-gritty working in local government, dealing with a million problems every day, firefighting all the time, it can be quite hard to find the time to connect with what colleagues are doing in other parts of the country and indeed in other countries. And that's not easy. So that's what these sessions are about, just sort of trying to give a space where we can come together, hear from some interesting people, see what people are doing around the world to tackle a particular issue. Now, this morning's discussion topic centers around disinformation and misinformation. What's the difference? You'll find out. We all know that, poor information, disinformation, about what's happening in our communities can have a really detrimental effect on local government, on the operations of councils, on community cohesion, on our place in the world. And this, you don't need me to tell you that this has become more and more of an issue, particularly with the spread of social media. We see it in everything from kind of, gossip around the school WhatsApp group to sort of Facebook campaigns against particular councillors. And, and it can range from just sort of slightly irritating, sort of that's not quite right through to really consequential sort of threats, abuse, etc. So local government also has a crucial role to play, we think, in addressing that challenge. It's one of these big global challenges that plays out in local and national politics, but we think local government has a crucial role to play in addressing this issue. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from our panel of experts this morning who are going to share their insights and experiences on both proactive and reactive strategies for tackling disinformation. So that's what we're doing here today. We're one of the world's biggest independent local government membership bodies, so we're committed to supporting you, our members, in your efforts to deal with challenges like this. We want to make sure you're informed, engaged, connected, and that you're heard, that we're listening to you, so that you can continue with your vital work in this space. So we hope that today's discussion will inspire you, will encourage you. We thank you for your ongoing support. And I think that's more than enough from me. I'm going to introduce, just to say, we've got three speakers who we're going to hear from for sort of 10 to 15 minutes each. There'll then be space for a Q&A, which I would, we'll talk more about this at the time, but I would say is as much about a conversation between all of you as it is a Q&A. It's a conversation, I think, rather than a question and answer. And we are recording, just as a housekeeping note, we're recording the speaker bit of the conversation, but I believe, and Simone will correct me if I'm wrong, that we don't record the Q&A. So that's a sort of Chatham House conversation where people should feel free to be up front. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Rachel Eden, old friend of LGIU, but more importantly, councillor and former mayor in Reading Borough Council in England, a unitary authority in southeast England, for those of you who are also just outside London, for those of you who don't know. She's had a whole range of roles there. She's been in opposition, but she's also been a cabinet member. She's been a committee chair. As I said, she's the former mayor. And she's also a specialist trainer in a lot of issues, but particularly relating to social media and finance management. But social media, I think, is the key thing for us today. Rachel, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. It's lovely to be with you this morning. I wanted to talk a little bit about what I think are two kind of related issues in disinformation and misinformation, and how actually my experience is that tackling these things, you have to kind of understand where it's coming from in order to know the right strategy, because actually you can end up being counterproductive if you kind of misunderstood the motivation. And to me, there's a big distinction between misinformation, which is really people just getting things wrong. So I had a very simple example in my ward. It doesn't always have to be online. Last week, I visited a sheltered housing unit, and the people there were absolutely convinced we were going to be closing one of our historic libraries. So, one of the beautiful libraries was founded by a foundation at the end of the 19th century. And that was misinformation. Actually, what's happening is we're building a new library in the town centre and just moving a completely different library into that new building. So it was misinformation, but it was well-meaning in the sense of they weren't happy about it, but it wasn't feeding into an existing agenda. And that's quite different from disinformation, where it's maybe intentional, it could be deliberately malicious, and the idea is to create an agenda. And it could be, it can be a state actor when we're looking at national level. It can often be a political party or a fringe politically aligned group. It can also be a conspiracy theorist. So I actually think some purveyors of disinformation don't even know that they're purveying disinformation because they genuinely believe it to be true. But I would still class them as disinformation because there's almost no fact that you could present them with that would make them change their minds. So if you think about that example with the library, by telling the residents in that sheltered accommodation the facts, they were quite happy to kind of be corrected, and they were quite pleased and relieved because they didn't want that thing to be true. Whereas a conspiracy theorist, and again, doesn't have to be online. I had a ward surgery where I've had multiple conversations about a 5G mast that seemed to be causing symptoms that I would associate with long COVID. And no fact that I could have presented about that would have changed those people's minds, because they were absolutely convinced. And that is where I think you get disinformation coming in. So the kind of things we're looking at here are where we're going to have quite emotive narratives. My experience is that sometimes the problem is with, particularly with disinformation, is that when you have a constructive narrative, it's easier to make it emotionally resonate. It's easier to make it a story because it doesn't have to fit with all the facts. Whereas if you're talking about something that's true, as we know, truth can be inconveniently boring or inconveniently non-emotive. So it makes it actually sometimes harder to overtake this. And the consequences can be quite severe. We've seen examples, and there was national coverage, for example, of the local elections in Oldham in 2021, where there was suggestions that the council leader lost his seat. I mean, he definitely lost his seat, that's just a fact, but there were suggestions that could have been because of disinformation that was posted on Facebook, very serious allegations, which appear to have no foundation in fact, but which had an influence on the result in that election. So it can be quite a severe impact. And these things have always existed. We all know it's not new. But I think perhaps some of the changes, we're seeing gatekeepers of information, traditional journalists being replaced by algorithms, more citizen journalism, which sometimes can be really helpful. And actually, as a local councillor, I have a good relationship with some of our citizen journalists, people who are, independent bloggers, who are just interested in the local community or a particular aspect of it. But equally, there isn't sort of quality check on those people. So some of those people are going to potentially have problematic approaches. And of course, the fact that things are online just means things can spread really quickly. So things that I found work, and I have not found the magic bullet on this, so that's not a surprise, I suppose, is firstly, do use what tools that the social media giants offer you. They are quite limited in my experience at countering these things, but, do flag and report. Obviously, it's been well documented that this doesn't always work, but it doesn't take much effort. The downside is that firstly, as I say, often there's no action taken. And secondly, it can actually feed into a martyr complex. And so actually feed a conspiracy theorist that we're somehow oppressing them by having, you know, Facebook, blocking someone on Facebook, for example, or blocking someone on X. But the big thing that I would say, and it's a very common mistake, and I've done it myself, is to kind of try and rebut the lie while repeating the lie. Now, when you've got misinformation, that can actually be fine. So if someone's genuinely thought that a historic library was closing, and you say, well, it's not closing, this is what's happening, that works. But when you've got a conspiracy theory, or you've got a malicious actor, or, you know, politically motivated person, repeating the lie amplifies it. So the example I always think of, and this wasn't actually a lie, it was just a sort of joke, but became kind of well known, was Penny Mordaunt was asked if the Prime Minister was hiding under a desk. And rather than saying, no, that's ridiculous, she did what is quite a common thing to do, which is to repeat the question. So she said, the Prime Minister is not under a desk. And that has become a soundbite. I think it was actually used by Newscast, which is a BBC podcast, in their titles for quite a long time. But you're repeating something that isn't true. Obviously, there was no question that the Prime Minister at the time was actually literally under a desk, but it amplifies. And I think the same applies when things are genuine lies, that you can amplify a lie by repeating it or rebutting it directly. So I think what's much more strong is to create a trusted, positive narrative. And this is where councils actually have a really big advantage over national politicians. You know, councils are the most trusted part of the public sector often, or certainly very trusted, and local councillors are more trusted than national politicians. So you can use your councillors actually on this, and I would recommend it. So creating a counter brand, creating a counter narrative, being accurate and values driven, this is all what you would expect from councils anyway. Being timely, so don't leave it, and using influencers, using people who are able to influence the narrative, who are trusted already. And it's really important, I think, and this is a danger when you know you're telling the truth, it's really important not to ignore the importance of telling a story. You know, stories work with human beings. We are a species that loves a story. So if you're telling a story, people will remember it more. So it creates that emotional resonance that's really important. And I found this really, really important, you know, whether it's dealing with conspiracy theorists who thought I mean, if you Google me and you go down far enough, you'll discover that apparently I'm a Mossad agent, you know, spoiler, I'm not. But that story, that narrative, you know, you can't counter it by denying it. You know, if I go around saying, I'm not in the pay of the Israeli state, you know, people will have heard that there's a possibility that I might be. If I go around promoting what I really do and what my real position is, then it creates a different story about me. So it reduces that counter arguing, and also making people feel they're part of it. So when I was mayor, I would do a lot of talking about Reading and what we were like as a town, and that created that emotional resonance. And you can do that whether it's a politician, a member of council staff, using so-called real people. I mean, we're all real people, but people who people perceive as being like them is really powerful. So, for example, in Reading, when we've brought in changes to our waste collection, so we brought in food waste collection, as many councils have done. And the way we did that was we got our refuse collectors to do little videos explaining how the system was going to work. And we even did an early adopters area, we did a trial area, and some of the people in that trial area agreed to talk about their experience. And you know, it might not sound that exciting, like, oh, we put our food in a different bin now, but it got loads and loads of traction on social media and lots of positive comments, in a way that if we just put out a very factual press release, just wouldn't have told that story. And I think that's what you can do with conspiracy theorists, is create that trusted positive narrative around, you know, it's not some kind of evil plan to oppress you that we're bringing in food waste collection. You know, it's for good reason, and it cuts through better that way. And remembering that people do live in bubbles, I think, is important about this. So not just thinking, well, this person's very influential. They may be influential with one group, but not with others. So, a good example here, I think, was there was obviously a lot of disinformation about the COVID vaccine that was put out. And there was some really good practice done to counter that disinformation. So using influencers. So with sort of the older generation, you might say, Sir David Attenborough going public that he'd received the COVID vaccine, that kind of thing. But then equally with young people having kind of young, cool doctors on TikTok talking about the COVID vaccine. And then at a very hyper-local level, many councils ask councillors to kind of publicly talk about their vaccination, and that particularly worked where there were some communities where misinformation and disinformation was going around about things. So, for example, there was some disinformation about the vaccine not being halal friendly, not being suitable for Muslims. So getting imams or councillors who were of Muslim faith to talk about that it was okay and that they'd had it was very, very powerful. So I guess there isn't a magic bullet on this, but I think that actually dealing with disinformation is really just good communication on steroids. You've got to tell a story, you've got to make people feel engaged, feel emotional resonance. And the advantage we have as councils and councillors is that we tend to be around for the long term. We're not fly-by-night organisations. So if you can create a trusted narrative on one thing, then it helps you with the next time you've got to communicate. Now, there's the downside to that is if you fail and you behave in an untrustworthy way once, then that creates a vicious spiral. But if you can make it a virtuous spiral that, well, they were trustworthy about this issue, people will then give you the benefit of the doubt on the next issue. So I think that's also really important. And I actually think we have a very big part to play as councils and councillors in ensuring that some of these very harmful narratives are countered.
Brilliant. Rachel, thank you so much. That's really, really helpful. And I think really hammering home the difference between misinformation and disinformation, and that they require different approaches to deal with them, I think is really important. I think the emphasis on storytelling, we've seen that in politics over the last 10 years, that you can't, spreadsheets don't beat stories. You need stories. And I love the idea of good communication on steroids. I think we all know that the point at which you're sick of the sound of your own voice saying something might just be the point at which someone else is starting to hear it. So that's amazing. I've got loads of questions, but I'm going to hold them, as I will ask all of you to do, because we're going to go through, hear from all of our speakers, and then open up for Q&A. So I'm going to pass straight over to our second speaker, another old friend of LGIU, Theo Blackwell, MBE, Chief Digital Officer for the Mayor of London. We knew Theo before he was an MBE. Indeed, before he was even Chief Digital Officer for London, back when he was a cabinet member in Camden. But Theo is Chief Digital Officer in London. He's the first one. He was appointed back in 2017. So he leads on digital transformation, data, smart city initiatives across the GLA group and the wider public sector. He's leads on all the sort of digital transformation on behalf of the mayor, supports innovation, tech, data-led approaches to service delivery, the whole shebang. But of course, in the times we're in, that means he is also at the forefront of dealing with misinformation and disinformation. Theo, welcome.
Hello and good morning, and apologies for being slightly late. There was an extra long patch that my computer decided to do this morning. But it's a real pleasure to be here. It's one of the curses of the job, or the job title, that basically technology doesn't function very well for me, especially when I'm about to speak on a panel. But there you go.
They covered it, Theo. They didn't even know you were late.
Masterfully done then. So I was going to share some slides that I did in preparation for this discussion. Can you see the slides?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
Okay, great. tackling misinformation, disinformation is something that has engaged us more and more at a Greater London Authority level. And I'm just going to go through three or four slides on the impact, the problem, and how we've thought about the solutions around this. So the impact that we see from disinformation and misinformation, and I haven't really thought about the big distinction between the two, but I suppose we could say disinformation is conscious attempts by actors, domestic and abroad, to muddy the waters, to promote a knowingly false narrative to people. And misinformation perhaps is the lighter version of that. But I'm not reaching for the OED here, and I'll stand corrected. But certainly what we've seen over the years is the impact of these things through social media being disruption to programs that the government or the Mayor of London has promoted. So that could include what we saw during the pandemic, false claims about vaccination. We saw pre-pandemic quite a lot of misinformation, disinformation around 5G and the impact of that on public health. And mindful of the fact that I'm in the middle of, the Mayor of London's in the middle of an election campaign, I would say that some of the environmental initiatives that the Mayor has pursued have also been subject to this, and this has been verified by third parties. More recently, manipulation of the democratic process. The Mayor himself was the victim of a deepfake audio, which was widely reported and the subject of a Marion Spring BBC podcast on that. So the manipulation of the democratic process through audio and video, which are the kind of most readily available and accurate forms of generative AI. We have the impact on social cohesion, the spreading of false rumours and tales about certain groups, the general undermining of trust in institutions. I wasn't going to just use government here, but also the undermining of medical institutions and other kind of pillars of society, if you like, through manipulated media. And of course, then there is direct and immediate reputational damage to individual groups or bodies, where the very speed of the spread of this can make rebuttal very, very difficult. So I see the problem as twofold. The first is the content itself, which is false, and secondly, the spread of it. So the amplification via social media platforms. So in a sense, you've got two actors here: the original actor or actors, domestic or foreign, and then you have the social media platforms that historically or until recently have certainly resisted any attempt to show that they're anything more than a kind of neutral host for all of these things, that they're not a publisher like a newspaper, and therefore they should be exempt from the normal kind of terrestrial laws that apply to everything else published. There's a legislation lag, as we've seen from the Online Harms Bill, that new laws take time to draft, debate and implement, and often leave quite big questions unanswered. So the Online Harms Bill, whilst it deals with deepfakes and pornography and the exploitation of children, has as unfinished business researcher access to social media platform data to allow us to understand the spread and amplification of these things. The remit and capacity of national bodies is still very much 20th century. So if you were going to call for more bodies to take action in this area, a lot of them lack the capacity or the remit to act, such as the Electoral Commission. Local government lacks resources or specialized teams to dedicate time and effort into this. And there are very few partnerships with third parties in this space that actually look at the production and amplification of these harms. Coordination and information sharing between local authorities, and I'm not a director of communications for a local council, so there are of course networks that of professionals that liaise with one another, but it is less advanced on the threats around misinformation than looking at that cyber threats, for example. The problem also rests with social media giants. There is an ability for local authorities, and certainly in London, we have requested takedowns in other areas of online harm, and have had some success. I'll just talk about that in a second. But how a local authority concerned about something can go to YouTube or go to another social media platform and get direct engagement, I think is something that still needs to be worked on, and seems to be something that we, as a regional authority where you've got directly elected mayor, very high profile, representing a population of 9 million, certainly have had some success. But what's it like for a local authority outside of that power structure? The problem also is dealing with the adaptability of methods. When we're talking about misinformation, disinformation 5 years ago, we were kind of talking about like online forums and the kind of viral spread of below the line comments. And now we're looking at very sophisticated content, cheaply and easily produced, and conscious social amplification networks, i.e. that a number of kind of super spreaders are consciously out there retweeting things or amplifying the message in a conscious way. And then finally, with local government, there's a question about public perception. Where does local government strike the right balance? One of the defenses of those who have spread disinformation and misinformation is that it's satire, or they're only asking questions, or that they embed a specific piece of disinformation within a wider piece which is verifiable. So there is there's an element where they're saying, well, 90% of the piece you have no problem with, and it is perfectly acceptable, and 10% of the piece isn't. Why are you stifling my freedom of expression? And it might not be the taste to. It might put politicians and leaders in the firing line to step into this territory, which then provides a sort of level of reticence to tackle the problem. So some observations that I think from a local government angle to conclude with. One is, I think local government, especially at regional level, is uniquely placed to convene and understand and transmit to government and social media platforms and others about the impact of those harms. We've seen in areas where we've looked at the impact, more broadly, the impact of online harms, such as I mentioned below, violent crime, online violence against women, the impact on young people, that we have the fora where we can kind of gather that evidence. But I don't think we're necessarily very good at then transmitting that evidence to those people who are making the laws. And the status of the Online Harms Act is that, yes, it took 3 or 4 years to put together, but there's a huge amount of guidance, almost like a kind of 2 or 3 year roadmap that Ofcom have to comply with, of producing various bits of guidance to flesh out what's in the legislation. And I think that's kind of a really important opportunity for the kind of lived experience of citizens and local government and institutions to feed into that process and arm regulators and parliamentarians with the evidence that they need. But I just don't think we've really strategized about how to do that effectively. So influencing lawmakers, I think, is a strategy. I mean, UK government develops and passes laws, and it's the role for local government to amplify the voice and lived experience of citizens to lawmakers. We need to be better at that. I think there's growing expertise because the broader issue of online harms is impacting many, many other service areas, and staff are becoming aware of it, and it's being fed through by users, that actually there's a growing body of knowledge. And so if I was going to sit down and talk across the, with teams across the GLA on the impact of the internet age on services, I would find that there was actually quite a growing body of talent, of people who are negotiating, interested, developing policy in this area. So it's something to start with. Fourthly, I think we need to change the behavior of platforms. I mentioned that the Online Harms Act still has sort of quite a lot of guidance to be published. That's a nice kind of like environment to be influencing those social media platforms. I know we should probably share more information about how we've certainly enabled takedowns, but is there more to be done? And I think a specific area for us, which is the final point that I'll conclude with, is that on the amplification side of misinformation and the role of social media platforms, local authorities, particularly urban ones, are home to many universities and researchers who are already engaged in the dialogue and discussion around how the internet should be regulated. And a key piece of legislation at European level is requiring access to platform data to understand how things are spread. This is unfinished business in the Online Harms Act. And I think there's a real opportunity actually for local government and the universities based in those areas to come together and change legislation and open the books up on social media platforms together, because it's having an impact on the way we govern our citizens. And we have, I think, the tools to do that if, and I'm being, sort of quite charitable here, if we give the evidence, lawmakers should be able to create better laws. Thank you.
Thank you, Theo. That is fascinating, and lots to get into there. But it does feel like there's a sort of gap, a sort of space for sort of collective action that we haven't quite got across local government, where we are, 400 odd institutions in this space. Anyway, we'll move on. So for our final speaker, we are whizzing all the way across the globe to South Australia. Rachel and Theo are both old friends of LGIU. Tony is a newer friend of LGIU, and one of our LGIU Australia members. Tony is chief exec of City of Marion in South Australia. He has a long history working leadership roles in various different levels of government, which I think is really gives really nuanced insight into this, and actually started his career in policing, became assistant Police Assistant Commissioner in 2005. He's also worked in big NGO spaces, stuff around National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island Education Strategy, which he chaired the development of, and he was chairman of one of the largest disability providers in South Australia. He's been chief exec in City of Marion since 2021. So, Tony, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks for the introduction, and really appreciate the opportunity to be with you despite the fact it's evening time. Hopefully you're hearing me okay.
We are indeed.
Great. Just check that just in case. You had a funny look on your face, so I just thought I might just check in there.
No, that's just my face, I'm afraid.
Well, you can't help bad luck sometimes. So no, thank you for being with you. It is great evening from obviously in Australia. And thanks for the opportunity to be involved. I certainly won't go over the ground well covered by Rachel and also Theo. I think they've given some great practical examples about the challenges, the wicked problem that does exist, but also from a global perspective as well. So if I can take the liberty, I guess, of bringing it down to my more practical environment from a chief executive in local government. But I need to probably say, you've sort of mentioned that I do come from a policing background, which probably has a different perspective when dealing with the community in relation to information. And I think by and large, and certainly still in Australia, police services, because of the uniform, are still largely very much respected and believed in relation to the dissemination of factual information. And we know in critical incident management, emergency management, those sorts of situations, we do know the public, generally speaking, go to the emergency services, the uniforms, to access information and also have the confidence that it's accurate information at the same time as well. For an unusual reason, I was asked to be the chief executive of the Education Department in South Australia. So I had responsibility for some 830 schools in our state. And what I did find was an extraordinarily different approach to the use, the dissemination, misinformation within the education environment than what I had experienced in the policing. Policing was very centralised and controlled and often had a trusting relationship with community. Conversely, in education, it was very much a decentralised communication, dissemination model and culture, very autonomous at the local level. And what I did struggle with, if I'm frank about it, was the fact that there was multiple versions of similar information, which I found created distrust and confusion by parents, carers, and others who were connected to education systems. I guess from my experiences now as a chief executive of a local government authority, we have 68 of those in South Australia. Mine's considered one of the larger local governments in South Australia. I guess I've really taken a more centralised governance approach to the gathering of information that we store on our systems, that we go to access and disseminate from time to time. So we have a centralised, more strict governance arrangement, which I do think actually helps us to minimise misinformation, which can go out at different levels of organisations for different purposes and different timeframes. I've also had the advantage in the last couple of years of sort of leading significant organisational digital reform. And we did take that advantage to ensure that we corrected poor sources of the truth, incorrect information that have been collected over many, many years on content management places, web pages, within information collection systems, customer relations management systems. We've been fortunate enough to go through and really strip out our legacy systems and put new systems in place. And we took the opportunity to literally draw a line in the sand to ensure that we had a customer-centric approach generally to the collection and utilisation of information as an organisation, and hopefully improve our reliability that when we sourced information, disseminated information, shared information, that it came from a believable, reliable, trusting source that we could rely upon in times of need, whether it was in the case of supporting community through a critical incident or an emergency, or it was just day-to-day providing information about the workings of the organisation or how they could access services. And certainly with a movement into more portal type platforms for service requests, and we're operating now at about 30% of our 70,000 requests a year are now coming through a portal provision. We also need to manage the way that we actually capture, use, regurgitate, and report on information through those portal systems as we build and continue to build those very respectful relationships that we have with our broader community, where they live, work, or play within the city of Marion in South Australia. So quite centralised. We've also built what I would call a communication dissemination hierarchy. So from a mayor, from a chief executive, from a general manager, right through to a person that works in a library, for example, within local government, we have a very structured dissemination model. And we try to adhere to that as best we possibly can to ensure that we don't get caught out with being complicit in the sharing or the dissemination of misinformation where the left hand doesn't know what the right hand knows and vice versa. So we have gone through a hierarchical structure to ensure that we maximise ensuring the information that we have responsibility for dissemination is the correct information. We're also very focused on ensuring that the political side of the business, from the elected members and officials, and the way that they use information, share information with their constituency, is very much aligned with the administration side of the organisation. Because from my 20 years at the 3 levels of government in Australia, it is often the case that I've seen and probably been a part of as a chief executive, where you tend to have a different focus on the utilisation of information for different purposes and different timeframes, and probably for different messaging purposes from an administration bureaucracy side of things as the political side. And certainly in the city of Marion, the mayor and the chief executive are the only 2 that have the authority to actually disseminate information or approve for the dissemination of information more broadly across the organisation or by elected officials. So we try and maintain a stronghold on that, because we want to be seen to have public confidence of the highest order, because people can rely on the information that they hear on talkback radio, on a news service, in the print media, or a press release that might go out under the hand of the chief executive at the same time as well. We also have built a culture where the whole of the organisation understands it needs to be an ambassador for dissemination of correct information, factual information that we can rely upon and the community can rely upon as well. And no matter what level of the organisation you operate within, there is a genuine understanding about the importance of getting information correct when we disseminate, and to minimise becoming complicit in disinformation or misinformation that goes out to the community, whether it's of a routine nature or more of a critical incident emergency management type response, when the community really does look for factual information that they can act upon, that they rely on at the same time as well. A couple of other points, if I can just make quickly, that in the city of Marion, we have gone to great lengths to bolster up our media and comms areas. And not because we necessarily want to promote the great things that we do all of the time, but it is about monitoring social media, which I think Theo responded to previously in some of his key points, that many organisations haven't invested well in its responsibility to ensure it's a party to monitoring and assessing particular social media platforms, because they are so prevalent and the information can disseminate at such a rapid rate that we actually monitor somewhat in real time, and we produce management reports through our business intelligence reporting on degrees of accuracy of information dissemination. So we have a business intelligence unit. Currently in my organisation, we have about 60 to 80 organisational key metrics that I bring my executive team of 16 managers plus myself together monthly within an auditorium. We have data dashboards across multiple areas of our business. And some of those key aspects are the way that we interact and communicate with our community, particularly about information through service requests. As I said, we have about 6,000 requests per month now, somewhere in excess of 60 to 70,000 a year in the city of Marion alone. And within our customer relations management system, we have now have mechanisms within to allow the community to actually take control of rating us in relation to the way that they present requests to the organisation. They have information provided to them that they're able to act upon and go about their business. So we have taken a fairly bold approach to give the power to the community about how they're rating us on a transaction by transaction basis. And a lot of that goes towards the transaction they have with our organisation, but a lot of it is about the public confidence they have in the organisation, the information that they're being provided with, either on a one-on-one basis or more broadly through the many social media platforms that we've come to rely upon at the same time as well. I guess from our perspective, above everything else, it is about public reputation and integrity. As an organisation, we espouse that view that if we don't have public confidence across the board, but particularly in reliability of information that we have responsibility for and for disseminating and responding to, then we're letting ourselves down and also our community, which I guess we are really there to serve at the same time. Two final points, please, Jonathan, just quickly. I acknowledge that the speed of information is so rapid, it's really difficult for all of us to monitor, fact check and stay on top of. But we try and do that to a reasonable extent, to a higher standard as best we possibly can. But I don't think we can be intimidated by releasing information, and at times we will get it wrong. We will give the wrong information, we'll rely upon the wrong facts. But the risk is that we become more risk adverse being in government environments than we already are, and I'd suggest we're already far too risk adverse in many cases. And the psychology of using information, disseminating information, has to be balanced by the need of giving out information in a timely fashion. And I accept that we won't get it right all the time. And from my organisation's perspective, if on occasions we get it wrong, well, what I would suggest, we get on the front foot as quickly as we can. We correct the status of the information, whether that's through media or talkback radio or press releases, but get on to ensuring that we correct misinformation, wrong information, as quickly as we possibly can. And we also take the approach that we don't necessarily segregate the importance of the information, whether it is of a critical nature or a routine nature. We just want to make sure that if there's wrong information, misinformation of any degree, that we correct it if it's wrong, and we take that responsibility very seriously. So they're just a couple of observations, I guess, from my own personal experience, and I guess from the City of Marion. There are differences across councils in Australia, 530 plus of them. South Australia, 68. People have different approaches. But we are very fortunate, I guess, like maybe the UK and other countries. We have a local government association. I actually chair the Chief Executive Advisory Body of the LGA, as it's referred to. And it's a great forum for chief executives who regularly come together across those 68 councils to talk about these wicked problems and complex issues as well. So we take advantage of the Chief Executive Advisory Forum for that purpose as well.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. And actually the South Australia LGA is very proactive in that space. I know we're meeting, Clinton is over at Clinton Jury, who heads that up, over in London in a couple of weeks, and we'll be seeing him. So much there. So now the look on my face is one of sort of bemused, of confusion, not just because that's so rich across all three speakers, that I'm trying. There's something in all of this, I think, really important about the interrelation with some institutional forms, and I think you brought that out very, very clearly, Tony. I thought it was really interesting to say, well, when I went from policing to education to local government, in each case there's a sort of different institutional form, different institutional cultures, different institutional governance that makes it all, that is different, and how we kind of negotiate across those, but also how we build our sort of in a world in which, as Theo was pointing out, there is less and less trust in institutions, how we use our sort of institutional virtues of sort of good governance and ability to sort of control information and to sort of tell narratives to sort of counteract some. I don't know, there's a sort of golden thread going through all of this that I'm sort of struggling to sort of bring out, that I need to think more about. And that's good, because when when panels leave me with lots to think about, I know it's been a good one. So basically, if I emerge in a state of dazed confusion, I think that's it. That's a good session. I've got loads of questions, but I'm sure you guys have as well. So let's open it up. You can do this whichever way you want. You can either drop a question in the chat, or you can do it the old-fashioned way. Put your hand up, either virtually or waving, and we'll get to you one way or another. If you are comfortable doing so, introduce yourself when asking a question. If not, don't. Who'd like to kick us off? I'm going to ask knowing there'll be a pause, I'm going to ask a simple question first while you think about it. Rachel, just going right back to the beginning, your distinction between misinformation and disinformation. And I think you made the important point that there are different tactics required in relation to those. So where it's malicious, the sort of repetition of the lie can be counterproductive. Your example of the Prime Minister. I mean, I was heartened by your confidence that the Prime Minister wasn't literally hiding under a desk. I wasn't quite so sure that in fact, but nonetheless, so that all makes sense. But how is it? Can you always tell? The question left in is like, well, yes, but do you always know? I mean, I was interested, and Theo went on to say, well, sometimes there's sort of bits of misinformation hidden amongst otherwise okay stuff. Is that deliberate? Is it how? Because I totally see that it requires a different approach, but I can also imagine that one could get quite a long way down the line and then realize, oh, actually, that wasn't an inadvertent mistake. That was, your library example was. I'm not saying that wasn't, but you could imagine sort of malicious actors using something like that just to sort of destabilize for the sake of it. And so how do you tell?
I mean, that is a really good question, and I've got it wrong before. Folks like Theo probably have, that professional expertise. One of the dangers we have as councillors who have day jobs. I mean, I'm an accountant, so I love a spreadsheet. You mentioned spreadsheets don't work. They only work on people like me. So you can get it wrong, and even as a council officer, even as a comms officer, you can get it wrong. You can assume someone's asking a perfectly innocent question, why hasn't my bin been collected? But actually they've got an agenda. So I think there's things, if it's a social media account, you can often look at their track record, because the first new account, you might think, okay, I'm going to engage with this. But if it's a repetitious pattern of behavior, just like you can in human interactions. The first time you have a disagreement with someone in the sort of physical world, you can take that to be an innocent or just a genuine disagreement. But if they keep on badgering you, and if you're a counsellor, they turn up at your surgery, if you're a council officer, they're constantly turning up at reception, then you kind of know, you get to learn. But you do have to spot the signs. And I would say that generally one of the big questions is who is the audience you're really interested in here? So in the case I used, which was a very innocent mistake, my audience genuinely was the residents of that sheltered accommodation. They're my residents, they're real people, they're my voters. They were my audience. On Facebook or Twitter, very often your real audience is not the person who's asking the question. Your real audience is the other people who are monitoring the conversation. So the first thing is do we want to escalate? If they haven't got a big audience of their own, if they've got a few followers, do we want to amplify their voice to our audience? Do we want to effectively give them a platform? But very often, and I've seen what's happened with Sadiq Khan, there are people who have got big audiences, they may be not just on social media, they may be on TV channels as well. So they've already got that platform. And in those cases, you haven't got that judgment to make, but what you have got the judgment to make is how do you engage with them? And as I say, very often the answer is, my experience anyway, is to not try and rebut line by line, because they will mix truth, and truths that are unpalatable or truths that are not entirely positive for you, with their agenda, and that makes it much stronger. A story is always stronger if it's got an element of truth, right? So same with these folks. So it's about telling your story as strongly as you can, and it's hard, no one's got a magic bullet on it, but I think Theo will say more about Sadiq Khan's approach with the clean air agenda. He talks, I think, powerfully, persuasively to me. I'm not a London resident, so I'm not really the audience, but persuasively to me about asthma and children's health, and that's a powerful story, and it's a powerful counter narrative to some of the stuff that goes around about him being, I guess, anti-driver or whatever the sort of latest thing is. So I think that you have to kind of think on a case-by-case basis, but always be alert to it. I think once you're aware of the distinction, it's much easier to spot.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And I guess that picks up in part a question we've got from Richard on the chat. And Tony, I was going to sort of ask you about this. Richard is saying, look, what's the rule of thumb about when you engage and when you don't engage, particularly on social media? If you're just overwhelmed with stuff, I'm guessing, I don't know, Richard, whether you're a councillor or an officer. I mean, this is a question I hear from a lot of councillors, that are just bombarded with things and you can't respond to everything. So what's the sort of, how do you know what's important to pick up and what's not? I mean, Tony, you talked about a kind of fairly aggressive is the wrong word, very proactive kind of approach to just sort of, really being on top of things. But is there a rule of thumb by which you can sort of say some things are just, okay, we'll just leave that, let that one go?
I guess if I'm honest about it, Jonathan, I think it's a little bit intuitive to be truthful about it. But in saying that, I'd take a view broadly that you've got to be more often in the story than out of the story. I think if you ignore it, things can run away from you. I think it's the comments are well made by Rachel, that she referenced the fact that you've got to be out there telling the story, which is a believable story because it's a factual story. So I tend to lean on the fact that you've got to be in the sharing of the information. You've got to be very robust in trying to get the factual information, do the fact checking out there. But at the same time, I think there are cases where you don't want to be seen to be throwing petrol on the fire, as it said, because you can just inflame the situation. And I think in today's media world and information sharing world, it moves so rapidly that a headline story today, as we know, is actually forgotten about tomorrow. So there is a sweet spot there, I think, about not over milking a story or the correction of information, because you actually might make things worse sometimes. So it is a bit of a judgment call.
Yeah, that's helpful. Theo, any reflections on that? I mean, obviously, you've also been on the other side of the fence as a councillor, that the world has changed an awful lot since then. Even though
I was thinking about my time in Camden, and there was one particular policy area which was very full of conspiracy theories and misinformation, which was around the council's proposed house building programme, which for a variety of reasons, some groups of people opposed, and I totally agree that the way one has to use one's common sense on whether you respond forcefully to everything, and I think probably the younger me did a bit more of that than I should, in order to sort of like hammer the truth in. But underlying that, there was a fundamental need which we really invested in, of telling the story about what we were doing and also how we were doing it. And I think the two components of the story, which is sort of like, here are the reasons, but also explaining the mechanics of how you are delivering something, is really, really important. And I'm now that I've moved into quite a contested field. When I started as Chief Digital Officer for London, it was 2017. Sidewalk Labs had just announced that they were going to redevelop what actually turned out to be, quite a small area of Toronto. But if you read those against it, it was like, a new Toronto. And their vision of building a smart city from the internet up, as they I think rather clumsily described it. And the reason why I raised that is that there was just quite a lot of conspiracy theorizing around what a smart city was, what the ulterior motives of technology companies or city bureaucrats were. And a tremendous part of my work, and a continuing part of my work, is that storytelling piece. And just going back to my previous point, I've emphasized two aspects to that. In fact, I've probably done more than I'd ever thought around storytelling, about why we're doing using technology, because I've focused on that, on not only the kind of overall objective of using technology, but the story of how. And I often challenge my colleagues that there's not enough of the story of how in what we do, and it's and I think that's an incredibly important component of the story.
Yeah, and I guess one of the advantages we have in local government compared to national government, and even I think compared to the scale you operate at across London, Theo, is that people can see the outcomes. So if you say, actually, we are building these houses and they're going to be here and they're going to be lived in by, key workers or whatever, people can actually see 2 years, 3 years down the line that those exist, and that there's the sort of feedback loop. You can close the feedback loop in a way that you can't do in national politics, because you're talking about things that are too far away. Any questions from the floor before I go on? Okay, let me ask something about partnership. So again, I'm not quite. There's this institutional point, but there's also, we don't operate in local government in a vacuum. So I'm sort of picking up Tony's point about different parts of the public realm have different organizational cultures and different ways of managing information, and different forms of digital infrastructure, and right down to some practical things might use different software. But actually, a lot of the issues that we're going to, misinformation and disinformation doesn't, not unreasonably, doesn't obey kind of institutional silos, and it will cut across, I don't know, policing and local government, or health and local government, or all three, across a whole range of issues. And so our response to this, how far does our response to this need to involve partner agencies? Does that complicate things further? Because in a way, what you've all described is quite clear kind of organizational strategies for responding to this. But if we're not alone as organizations, how does that help or complicate the picture? Theo?
I mean, look, I certainly think that an important driver for disinformation has been foreign actors. And I think there's some realization of that, but I don't think, I think there's a very sort of high level understanding that this might be happening. If you went to other European countries, and a couple of years ago, I was in Finland at meeting the CDO of Helsinki, and we sat down to a very interesting talk from their national broadcaster, who explained the methods that the Russian government was using to undermine Finnish society, starting with the undermining of institutions and the spreading of mistrust. And they went through it bit by bit according to their analysis. And so I'm not suggesting that this is, that people believe that this is just a sort of minor thing, or it's just incidental. But I do believe that those in national government institutions could tell that story and explain how these social media channels are being used, how amplification is happening, and what the triggers are to a broader group of decision makers, so that they would get a sense of how this is playing out in their local area. And I think national government institutions who are responsible for protecting us against cyber threats and also in this area perhaps are a little bit kind of cards too close to the chest, when in fact some greater understanding about how this particular kind of corner of misinformation, disinformation spread actually works.
Yeah, that's helpful. Tony, thinking about the differences in context although interesting, I've spoken to other chief execs in South Australia who've seen quite a lot of election disruption and it's not clear to no particular end, and the end appears to be just the disruption and I think that's part of the challenge here, isn't it? Where you're thinking about misinformation, thinking, oh well, they must want something, and what's the kind of end game? But sometimes the end game is just the disruption, and is just the process is the means is the end, as it were. And that makes it. Can that make it even harder to deal with, because you're not, you're responding to a fairly incoherent sort of set of threats?
I think the answer is yes. Certainly from an institutional perspective, we can't take for granted for one moment, and I'm not suggesting we are collectively, we can't take for one moment that local government institutions are in a strong position to be believed when they're involved in the use and dissemination of information. From my experience, sadly, I can talk from an Australian perspective, but I think it is similar in many of the countries that LGIU are connected with, is that governments struggle to maintain public confidence in relation to the way they conduct their business and their reliability for telling a story or giving reliable information to the community. So what I do know is that we have to work so much extra harder to be able to be convincing and have people necessarily believe the things that we say we're going to do, or the things that we're doing, or the way we share information. Unlike the privileged position I had for many years in policing, by and large, a police organisation, and when you see a chief constable in the UK or a police commissioner in Australia, or even the bobby on the beat gives some information, there is largely a tendency for people to believe the information in the first instance, unless there's something to show otherwise. So I think it really is important, that institutional thread that you're looking for maybe is that as local governments, we really need to take a different approach to the use and dissemination and correction of information, because I think we generally have to work harder, because we don't start from a position of strength when it comes to the utilisation and sharing of information.
That's interesting. And that's true, because obviously one of the big differences is that your local politics is not as overtly party political as we have here in the UK.
Somewhat. It does vary, just for, I guess, listeners who may not be in Australia, and I sense that might be a number of them, is that in some parts of Australia, in our state governance arrangements, through the constitutional arrangements, we do have compulsory voting in states like Victoria and New South Wales, and you will tend to see a far more political alliance in the people that stand for council elections. South Australia, we're yet to mandate voting, and it is being considered right at this minute I'm speaking. There's a review in relation to local government structures and governance, and it is being touted for the introduction of compulsory voting in South Australia. Hasn't happened yet, but we do have variances around the country in relation to the more factional approach that sit within councillors and local government elections in some parts of Australia than others.
But do you think that makes any difference in terms of because I guess one of the bits of feedback that sometimes we get in English councils and Scottish councils, less so in Ireland, is, oh well, it's all just about party. One of the sort of distrust in political parties plays a role in distrust in local government, and I'm just interested to know whether that makes a big difference or not, because what I see in the Australian context is that actually, I'm not sure that's as big a deal as, or as consequential as we sometimes think it is here.
Yeah, it is certainly different. If I was to put my finger on one thing that I think is abundantly different, in Australia with 27 million people, unlike the UK, for example, with 60 million, we have 3 levels of government. And by and large, most Australians think we're over-governed and you should get rid of one of the tiers of government and go to a 2-tier system like the UK or New Zealand, for example. So there is this frustration and a lack of empathy, I guess, for local government, because it's often questioned as to whether it's an unnecessary tier of a system in Australia with 3 tiers of government. So once again, I'd sort of espouse the view that we have to work so much harder as an administration and elected official group when we're using information, correcting information, minimising misinformation, that we have to work harder, because we start from a point where the general community questions as to whether or not we should even be playing a part in the delivery of services.
Yeah, yeah.
That's interesting.
Rachel, I guess that speaks to somewhat to your point about, because one of the things that that's right, Tony. I'm not convinced, though. For example, in London, I'm not going to ask Theo to comment on the Met, but I think we have, the Met Police in London, for example, has had severe trust issues over the last couple of years, and I'm not, in many communities, I'm not sure that they would be seen as a trusted place. I mean, it's something about identifying your champions.
Absolutely, and this is what I was thinking. I was absolutely thinking of that example, because I'm not based in London. I can probably speak more freely about the Met, but I won't. But I think there is a distinction in different areas as to who your trusted folks are. So in the UK, because of the kind of almost the national religion of the NHS that we have, your absolutely most trusted group, despite occasional, shocking cases, is your doctors and your nurses. And I think it will vary from not just country to country, but also even from local authority area to local authority area. But I think one common thread is that personal relationships trump everything. So if there's an individual within a system who people admire, respect, trust, that can be a very hyper local level, that is going to have much more power than, however trusted the institution is, a faceless institution. So it just as with we know humans like stories, humans like faces, humans like a personal touch. So the best way to change someone's mind is to talk to them face to face, in my experience. The next best is probably video. Certainly a press release with no human being attributed to it is probably, to me, often the weakest way of getting that emotional resonance. So it's about understanding your community. And so some people on the call will be thinking, well, doctors in our area are not trusted, or police in our area are not trusted, but there will be a most trusted local group that you can ally with. And sometimes that is civic society as well. So, we should be aware of the importance, as local government we are, because we always partner with charities, we always partner with religious groups. Often your imam, your rabbi, your priest is the person you will listen to on something. So if they are a force for truth and a force for kind of, coherence and against conspiracy theories, they can be an incredibly powerful ally as well. So I think we should look wherever trust is found. And I think these seem like very small micro things. When we're facing, as Theo rightly mentions, a serious attempt to undermine truth and trust. And I think you said, Jonathan, there isn't always a clear purpose to some of this misinformation. And I would argue that actually undermining democracy, ultimately, it sounds a bit grandiose, is actually the purpose, because in the end, if we can trust in local government, if we can trust in state and national government, it means that the sphere of influence of a sort of ideology that doesn't believe in that kind of approach to the world is strength. So I think we should see ourselves. It sounds a bit grand when you're saying, "Oh, I'm countering a Twitter troll," but we are part of the fight for a better way of doing things.
100%. Yeah, no, I 100% agree. I guess what I meant is there's no proximate cause that you can sort of address, like, oh well, if we, you know, it's not like your library's example where there's a thing that you can fix.
Yeah.
I was struck by, I mean, interestingly, by the way, that might also, you know, think about Tony's point, that is part of the argument for local government, because even at a state level, putting faces and trusted sort of people and knowing the community at that with that granularity can be hard. I was trying to see, Tony, you were saying that press releases are signed off by you or the mayor. So it is exactly that, isn't it? It's saying, look, here is a person that is saying an accountable figure that you can look to. We might come back to Tony.
Jonathan, if I can please add, sorry to jump in there, but I think inherently though, both elected officials and executives of local government inherently want to put a positive spin on things by nature of who we are. And I guess what I've certainly found is you get a lot of brownie points if you're willing to be more frank and getting on the front foot, accepting I didn't get it right. And for some reason, we inherently do not want to ever concede we didn't get it right. We always look for this spin. And I think sadly over many years now, officials, whether they're elected or executives or senior managers, have undermined that confidence in that relationship between the constituency and ourselves, because inherently we just find it difficult not to be more frank in the way that we share information and communicate, because we always want to put the positive spin on something by nature.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that comes back to your point about organizational culture and getting that right. We'll come back, Theo, quickly, because I've got another question I want to get into. So you're muted, but you're okay. I'm going to go to the other question, then I'm going to bring you all back for a final word. So, question from Jonathan Williams, which I think is a different angle into this, but also important. It says, as a parent, I'm constantly battling my children's access to online harm and misinformation. Theo talked a bit about the online harms bill. I was going to approach my 9-year-old's friends' parents about making a pact about giving them phones when they're 12 or 13. I found out they already have them, access to YouTube, etc. Should local, I think that's a scenario many of us recognize. Should local authorities have a role in assisting parents and educational settings to organise and influence culture around these issues? And I guess I would add, and if so, how? Where shall we go? Rachel, you might take a few from you on that.
Yes, I mean, I have a 13-year-old and an 11-year-old, so it's quite personal as well. I mean, of course, in many areas, local authorities are also the education authority. Obviously, it varies from region to region, country to country. I think there is a role for local government in terms of disseminating good practice and guidance. I think obviously national government ought to be stepping up on some of these issues, and actually internationally, because these are, a lot of the harms are caused from international factors. But I think as local authorities, again, we're placed to have those more localized conversations and share good practice. And I think that's where perhaps an organisation like the LGIU might want to disseminate good practice, look at what is going on, and then as a local authority you can contextualise it, because there are obviously huge benefits. I mean, my daughter is actually doing quite a lot of her studies online at the moment for health reasons, and it's a huge benefit to her that she has access to good information and educating our young people. So I think, I have every sympathy with the idea of not allowing 9-year-olds to have mobile phones. I certainly didn't, but by the time they're 13, actually the emphasis might shift as good practice to educating our young people about how to distinguish between good information, useful information. They don't have to go to the library and scroll through that shows my the generation I am. Not scroll, what is it you do with books? Read a book. Read a book. You can just search it up, as my kids say. And that's a huge benefit. So I think it's more about sharing good practice at local government level, but that's not to say I don't think there should be more regulation. I just think that perhaps the right tier for that to happen is at a more national and perhaps supranational level.
I'm not going to get triggered by the when we flip from searching for things to searching it up. It drives me mad. But I reckon I'm on the wrong side of history. And I'm not going to say anything about libraries, because whenever I say anything about libraries, I get in trouble. Tony, I mean, I guess that's an issue that looks the same in Australia, right? There's no, exactly the same conversations there about children's access to social media, the potential harms of that. Do you see a role for local government in there?
The conversations are exactly the same. There's no doubt about it. I think they're very universal these days, Jonathan. Yeah. Probably because we have 3 tiers of government, it's probably easier to discern on this topic, not most topics, but this topic, that it is a state and a national government responsibility. In saying that, local governments, authorities in Australia tend to want to help everybody on every issue. So through our community centres and our libraries, we would disseminate and share and help educate, inform a lot of people on the dangers of those sorts of things. I'm not sure about the UK, but just interestingly, in South Australia, we've banned mobile telephones during school hours. So children are no longer able to have telephones in the classroom unless there's particular exemption. I'm not suggesting that's going to help the overall situation, but there is a move to try and sort of curb the distraction of telephones. And in the case of our schools, it is about focusing on education and not being distracted by all of the social media platforms.
I think in the UK, the government just issued a sort of proclamation on that, but a lot of schools are way ahead of them. I mean, certainly both my kids' schools, smartphones are banned completely, and that's been completely uncontroversial, actually, and works. Yeah. Theo?
I mean, just in terms of Jonathan's question, I mean, sort of case in point, when teachers started noticing boys at school talking about Andrew Tate all the time and idolizing him, and when they started uncovering where they were getting the information from, how did we deal with it as a society, as a government? And I think we have instances where, this was a case of effectively misogynistic misinformation, disinformation going around, and we need to kind of have a wash up of how concerns were raised and how they were addressed and how they were put through to lawmakers who could take action to safeguard children from these things. So I think the tools are there, the processes aren't necessarily there. And just going back to the points that I made in the presentation, we've got a fundamental role in local government to be that voice of people who work with people and citizens themselves, to educate lawmakers on what actually is happening to the ground. Because I can tell you, as with in a previous career when I worked in the tech industry, although not for a social media giant, it's they are omnipresent in the halls of power and dealing with civil servants and coming up with arguments about how democracy will be constrained if you do anything to them, and they are champions of freedom of speech, etc., etc. So that needs to be kind of countered and modified by the experience that we reflect.
And they pay a lot of people a lot more money than we can to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Look, right. So we've got 4 minutes left. My only talent in life is closing meetings on time. So I don't want to lose that. But I'm getting a few people are now starting to ask questions. Right. So I'm going to take 2 questions. I'm going to then, instead of giving the panel, I'm going to give the panel 1 minute to respond to those questions and to give any final thoughts. So I've got a question from Jenny on the chat. If it becomes clear external people are driving dissent locally, and we know that there are, I'm thinking about Oxford, for example, around their LTN stuff, there was a lot of that. Is it helpful to make this visible or not? And then I've got a question in live from S. Wellesby. Do you want to ask your question quickly?
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, go.
It's a direct question. I'm Steve Wellesby. I'm Communications Manager at the City of Lincoln Council in Midlands, which is a similar-sized city to Marion for Tony. So my question is directly to Tony, not an empire-building one, but what I wanted to know was he made reference to recently bolstering the media and communications unit at the authority, and I wondered what that entailed.
Okay, brilliant. I'll come to Tony first on that.
30 seconds. We've put a senior manager in charge. So we've elevated the management governance. We've increased the numbers. We've increased specialisation. So we have graphic content, operations. So we've been very much specialised, but at the same time multi-skilled. So increased numbers, but increased roles, responsibility, and centralisation of good governance would be probably the most prominent change that we've seen to get more consistent, reliable information sharing.
I'm sensing a degree of envy from Steve.
Correctly.
Yeah. Rachel, helpful to make it clear if external people are driving dissent?
Yeah, I was pondering that. I think that deliberately kind of talking about the specifics may sometimes be unhelpful, but what I do think is helpful is shining a light on that this is a thing that happens. People love to know the real story and to be cleverer than other people. And that's why conspiracy theories flourish. So if you're able to get across to people the real story is these outside actors, and again, people like insiders, outsiders, in-groups, out-groups. If you explain the real story as that is what is going on and help people be alert to it and spot it, it actually feeds us psychologically to know that we've got the real skinny, if you like, on things. And actually that can be a very powerful tool to counter these people. These people do it in the shadows. They pretend to be someone they're not. So we can see this even in national politics. MPs are always, not always, but certain MPs have in the past been subject to people pretending to be someone they're not. We're all experienced it. It doesn't matter how sophisticated you think you are. So I think being able to shine a light on things, and that is what we're supposed to be in local government. We're supposed to be telling people the truth, and it builds trust and it builds relationships. And I think ultimately in the end, this is about human beings.
Yeah.
Take it away from screens and anonymized sources and show that it's some guy in a bedroom in, Moscow or somewhere. It takes away the mythology of it as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Theo, final 30 seconds.
I mean, nothing really to add. I mean, I just amplify the point that we are potentially great transmitters of evidence impact of the problem to those who can take action and pass laws on this.
Yeah,
because that's what's needed.
But maybe we need to get better at aggregating that process.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Guys, thank you. That was really, really awesome. That's given me a lot to think about, a lot to sort of feed into our work. So look, thank you, Tony. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Theo. That's really, really, really stimulating session. Thanks to Jen and Simone for making it all happen. And thank you to everyone for attending. We're out of time, so I'm just going to draw it to a close. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day or your evening. Bye.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.